For many years, the conflict between Israel and Iran has been a simmering, clandestine affair. It was a so-called shadow war, fought through proxies, cyber attacks, and covert assassinations, all carefully managed to avoid direct state-on-state confrontation. However, the events of the last few days have really shattered this fragile understanding, dragging this long-standing animosity out from the shadows and into the harsh light of open warfare. Before we proceed, kindly like, comment and subscribe to this YouTube channel to enjoy more content. On June 13, 2025, Israel initiated a massive military operation, codenamed Rising Lion, striking deep within Iranian territory. This was not a limited surgical strike. It was a broad and audacious assault, targeting the very heart of Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure, a move that has, without a doubt, irrevocably altered the strategic landscape of the Middle East and sent shockwaves across the globe. The scale and scope of the Israeli attacks were, honestly, unprecedented. Fighter jets and long-range missiles targeted critical facilities near Tehran, Isfahan, and the heavily fortified nuclear sites at Natanz and Fordo. Explosions rocked the capital, with reports of fires at Mehrabad International Airport, a hub for both civilian and military activity. The message was clear and unambiguous. Israel was no longer willing to tolerate what it perceived as an existential threat from a nuclear-arming Iran. In response, Iran's retaliation was swift and furious. It launched a barrage of hundreds of ballistic missiles towards Israel, triggering air raid sirens across the country and bringing the reality of this new, terrifying phase of conflict directly to Israeli cities and towns. This terrifying exchange of fire represents a fundamental departure from the previous rules of engagement. The unwritten agreement to avoid direct military clashes has been torn to shreds. What was once a contained, albeit dangerous, regional rivalry has now exploded into a direct confrontation between two of the most powerful military forces in the Middle East. Each side has crossed a red line that was long considered inviolable, setting in motion a dangerous cycle of escalation that is proving incredibly difficult to control. The world now holds its breath, watching to see what the next move will be in this high-stakes game of brinkmanship, fearing that each retaliatory action pushes the region, and potentially the world, closer to a catastrophic full-scale war. The immediate question on everyone's mind is why now? What prompted this dramatic shift from covert operations to overt military strikes? According to Israeli officials, the Rising Lion campaign was a preemptive measure, launched based on intelligence that suggested Iran was mere days away from accumulating enough fissile material for several nuclear weapons. This perceived imminence of a nuclear-armed Iran, a scenario Israel has vowed for decades to prevent at any cost, appears to have been the catalyst. For Iran, the attacks are seen as an outrageous act of aggression and a violation of its national sovereignty. The subsequent missile barrage was framed as a necessary and justified response, a demonstration of its resolve to defend itself and exact a heavy price for the assault. Beyond the strategic calculations and geopolitical maneuvers, the most immediate and tragic consequence of this new open conflict is its devastating human cost. In Iran, the Israeli strikes have left a trail of death and destruction. According to reports from Iran's envoy to the United Nations, the attacks have killed at least 78 people and wounded more than 320. These figures include not just military personnel, but also a significant number of civilians who were sadly in the wrong place at the wrong time. The strikes on Tehran, a densely populated capital city, inevitably resulted in collateral damage, turning urban neighborhoods into scenes of chaos and grief as rescue workers frantically searched through rubble for survivors. The Israeli assault was also remarkably precise in targeting Iran's leadership. In a stunning blow to the Iranian regime, the strike successfully eliminated a significant portion of its senior command. Armed Forces Chief of Staff Major General Mohammad Bagheri, the head of the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hossein Salami, and even Ali Shamkhani, a key figure who oversaw the nuclear negotiations. The loss of such a large part of its experienced military and political leadership in a single stroke is a crippling setback for Tehran, creating a power vacuum and fueling an intense desire for vengeance among the remaining commanders. Israel, while better protected by its sophisticated, multi-layered air defense systems, did not escape unscathed. Iran's missile barrage managed to penetrate these defenses, causing casualties and damage. At least one person has been confirmed dead, and around 40 others have been injured, some critically, as Iranian missiles slammed into Israeli territory. Buildings in Ramat Gan and central Tel Aviv sustained direct hits, shattering the sense of security for residents who are now living under the constant threat of attack. Furthermore, the conflict's reach has extended beyond the two main belligerents. A stray missile fired by Iran-backed Houthi forces in Yemen tragically landed in Hebron in the West Bank, wounding 3 Palestinian children and illustrating how quickly such a conflict can spill over and harm uninvolved populations. The assassinations of Iran's top nuclear scientists represent another chilling aspect of this campaign. Alongside the military commanders, at least 6 of Iran's leading nuclear experts were reportedly killed in the Israeli strikes. This move is clearly aimed at decapitating Iran's nuclear program, not just by damaging its facilities, but by eliminating the human expertise required to run it. For Iran, this is an unforgivable act, and the nation's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has promised a painful revenge. The newly appointed IRGC commander, Major General Mohammad Pakpour, has echoed this sentiment, vowing severe retaliation and warning that nowhere in Israel would be safe, ensuring that this cycle of violence and retribution is far from over. To understand the ferocious intensity of the current conflict, one must look back at the long and complex history of antagonism between Israel and Iran. This is not a new fight. It is the violent culmination of over 4 decades of deep-seated ideological and geopolitical rivalry. Before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran under the Shah was actually a strategic ally of Israel. However, the revolution transformed the relationship overnight. The new theocratic regime, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, branded Israel as the little Satan and an illegitimate entity in the heart of the Muslim world. Since then, Iran's foreign policy has been driven by a core principle of opposing Israel's existence and challenging its influence across the Middle East. This ideological opposition quickly manifested in a tangible military and strategic threat. Iran began to cultivate a network of proxy forces across the region, creating what it calls the axis of resistance. This network includes powerful groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories, and various militias in Syria and Iraq. For decades, Iran has armed, trained and funded these groups, using them to wage a proxy war against Israel. These groups have allowed Iran to challenge Israel on its borders without engaging in direct state-to-state conflict, creating a persistent and lethal threat that has defined Israeli security concerns for a generation. From Israel's perspective, Iran's actions represent an existential threat. The combination of Iran's hostile rhetoric, its funding of terrorist groups dedicated to Israel's destruction, and most critically, its pursuit of nuclear capabilities, is seen as an unacceptable danger. Israeli leaders have long maintained that they will do whatever is necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. This has led to a long-running shadow war, which has included cyber attacks targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, such as the Stuxnet virus, and the targeted assassinations of numerous Iranian nuclear scientists over the years. These actions were designed to slow down the nuclear program and disrupt Iran's regional ambitions without triggering a full-blown war. The recent escalation signifies that this long-standing strategy of containment and covert action has reached its limit. Israel's decision to launch Rising Lion was born from a belief that the proxy war and sabotage were no longer sufficient. The assessment that Iran was on the verge of a nuclear breakout appears to have convinced Israeli leadership that the time for indirect measures was over, and only direct military action could avert the perceived danger. Iran, in turn, views Israel's actions, particularly its attacks on Iranian soil and the killing of its top commanders, as a direct assault on its sovereignty and national pride, compelling it to retaliate in kind and demonstrate that it will not be intimidated. The most terrifying element of this escalating crisis is the nuclear dimension. The entire conflict is fundamentally centered on Iran's nuclear program, and the direct targeting of nuclear facilities has introduced a level of risk that is, frankly, unprecedented in modern warfare. Israel's stated justification for the Rising Lion campaign was to prevent Iran from building a nuclear bomb. This has been Israel's primary security concern for decades, a red line that successive governments have sworn to uphold. The recent attacks on the Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan facilities were a direct attempt to physically dismantle the infrastructure that Israel believes was on the brink of producing weapons-grade material, transforming a theoretical threat into a direct military confrontation over nuclear assets. The danger of striking nuclear sites cannot be overstated. According to Rafael Grossi, the chief of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Israeli strike on the Natanz facility, while destroying an above-ground plant, also caused a manageable chemical and radiological leak. While this incident was contained, it serves as a stark warning of the potential for a much larger nuclear disaster. A successful strike on a reactor or a heavily fortified enrichment facility like Fordo, which is buried deep under a mountain, could release vast quantities of radioactive material into the atmosphere, causing an environmental catastrophe that would affect not only Iran but the entire region for generations. The very act of targeting these sites creates a new and terrifying precedent. The context of these attacks is also critical. Just before Israel launched its campaign, the International Atomic Energy Agency had, for the first time in 2 decades, formally censured Iran for its lack of cooperation and non-compliance with its nuclear obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This international condemnation lent a degree of legitimacy to Israel's claims about the secretive and potentially hostile nature of Iran's program. Iran has always publicly insisted that its nuclear ambitions are for peaceful energy purposes only. However, its continued enrichment of uranium to high levels of purity and its obstruction of international inspectors have fueled deep suspicion in Israel and the West, creating the diplomatic backdrop against which this military action was launched. The ultimate fear is that this conflict could escalate into a nuclear exchange. While Iran does not yet possess nuclear weapons, this very conflict could become the ultimate justification for its leadership to pursue them with renewed vigor, arguing that they are the only true deterrent against foreign attack. If Iran were to eventually develop a nuclear arsenal, the dynamics of the Middle East would be fundamentally and terrifyingly altered. Any future conflict would carry the risk of nuclear annihilation, creating a permanent state of high-stakes tension. This is the specter that haunts the current crisis, the fear that today's conventional warfare is setting the stage for tomorrow's nuclear standoff, a reality the world has not faced with such intensity for decades. As the Middle East teeters on the brink, the world's major powers have been forced to react, and honestly, their responses reveal a deeply divided international community. The United States, Israel's most crucial ally, has found itself in a delicate and precarious position. The White House has confirmed that American military assets, including sophisticated THAAD missile defense systems and naval destroyers in the region, were used to help Israel intercept the barrage of Iranian missiles. However, American officials have been quick to stress that the United States was not involved in the offensive strikes on Iranian soil. This carefully calibrated response, defensive support without offensive participation, is designed to show unwavering solidarity with Israel, while at the same time trying to avoid being dragged directly into a war with Iran. The political situation in the US adds another layer of complexity. Former President Donald Trump, a prominent political figure, has made several contradictory statements. Initially, he urged Tehran to accept a nuclear deal to stop the Israeli bombing, suggesting that diplomatic talks had been scheduled. Later, though, he praised the Israeli strikes as excellent, reflecting a deep division even within American political discourse on how to handle the crisis. This lack of a unified message from Washington could be perceived as weakness or indecisiveness by both allies and adversaries, potentially complicating efforts to de-escalate the situation and creating uncertainty about what America's next move might be if the conflict continues to spiral. On the other side of the geopolitical chessboard, China and Russia have voiced strong condemnation of Israel's actions. China expressed extreme concern over the escalation and, without naming Israel directly, criticized the violation of Iran's sovereignty. Beijing has offered to act as a mediator, referencing its recent diplomatic success in brokering a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023. Russia has taken a similar stance, condemning the Israeli aggression and also offering to mediate a ceasefire. Both nations see this crisis as an opportunity to challenge American influence in the Middle East and position themselves as alternative power brokers and peacemakers, further deepening the global rivalry with the United States. Other influential nations are desperately calling for calm. Key European powers, including the United Kingdom, France and Germany, have joined a chorus of voices urging restraint and de-escalation from both sides. India, a rising global power with strong ties to both Israel and nations in the Gulf, has also called for a peaceful resolution. However, these calls for diplomacy are competing with the powerful momentum of military escalation. The world is watching as the United States tries to support its ally without triggering a wider war, while China and Russia seek to exploit the situation to their strategic advantage. This great power dynamic transforms a regional conflict into a global chessboard, where every move is scrutinized for its impact on the international balance of power. Away from the high-level strategy rooms and diplomatic meetings, the true victims of this conflict are the ordinary people of Iran and Israel, who are now living in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. For civilians in Iran, particularly in major cities like Tehran, the Israeli strikes have shattered any semblance of normal life. The sound of explosions and air raid sirens has become a terrifying new reality. Reports from within the country describe a palpable sense of panic, with citizens scrambling to secure basic necessities amid fears of rising prices and shortages of food and medicine. The economic situation, already fragile due to years of international sanctions, is now under immense strain. The fear of what might come next is driving many to take desperate measures. There are accounts of people attempting to flee the cities for the relative safety of the countryside, while others are rushing to exchange their local currency for foreign dollars, anticipating a catastrophic collapse in the value of the rial. The sophisticated, targeted nature of the Israeli strikes, which decapitated much of the military and scientific leadership, has also created a deep sense of vulnerability and paranoia among the populace. The conflict is not just a distant news story. It is a terrifying, immediate threat that has turned daily routines into a gamble with fate, as people worry whether their homes, workplaces, or neighborhoods might be the next target. In Israel, the situation is similarly grim, though different in nature. While the country's advanced air defense systems, like the Iron Dome and Arrow, have intercepted many of the incoming Iranian missiles, they have not stopped all of them. The successful strikes on Tel Aviv and other areas have brought the war home to Israeli civilians in a way that the long-running shadow war never did. The constant wail of air raid sirens forces families to rush into bomb shelters, disrupting lives, closing schools, and grinding the economy to a halt. The psychological toll of living under a constant missile threat is immense, creating a society-wide anxiety that hangs over every aspect of daily life. This shared experience of fear and suffering extends beyond the borders of the two main combatants. Protests have erupted in cities around the world, including in New York, where demonstrators have gathered to condemn the Israeli strikes and call for peace. The conflict is having a profound economic impact globally as well. The immediate surge in crude oil prices, driven by fears of a wider war that could disrupt supply from the Persian Gulf, is a clear indicator of the conflict's far-reaching consequences. OPEC has stated that the escalation does not yet warrant changes to oil production, but the markets remain on a knife's edge, reflecting the global economic instability that this regional war is already causing for people everywhere. The danger of the current Israel-Iran conflict is that it is highly unlikely to remain contained between just two nations. The Middle East is a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and proxy forces, and a direct war between two of its most powerful states threatens to set off a chain reaction, a domino effect that could engulf the entire region, and from there, the world. Iran has spent decades building its axis of resistance, a network of militant groups that could be activated to open up new fronts against Israel. While groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza have been degraded over the past year, they still possess significant capabilities to inflict harm. A full-scale war could see Iran calling on all its proxies to launch coordinated attacks on Israel from multiple directions. Hezbollah, for example, possesses an arsenal of over 150,000 rockets and missiles, capable of overwhelming Israel's air defenses and causing widespread destruction. Attacks could also be launched from Syria, Iraq, and Yemen by Iran-backed militias. Such a multi-front war would stretch Israel's military to its breaking point and lead to a dramatic escalation in violence and casualties across several countries. It would transform a bilateral conflict into a sprawling regional catastrophe, drawing in neighboring states and destabilizing an already volatile part of the world. The economic consequences of a wider regional war would be catastrophic for the entire globe. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which about a fifth of the world's oil supply passes, is located right on Iran's doorstep. In a major conflict, Iran could attempt to close this critical choke point, which would cause an immediate and dramatic spike in global energy prices. The resulting economic shock would likely trigger a global recession, affecting industries, supply chains, and the cost of living for people in every country. The interconnectedness of the global economy means that a war in the Middle East would not stay in the Middle East. Its effects would be felt in petrol prices, grocery bills, and stock markets from Tokyo to London to New York. This is how a regional clash begins to look like the prelude to a world war. A spiraling conflict in the Middle East would inevitably demand the attention and intervention of global powers. The United States is already defensively involved, and a wider war could easily lead to American casualties, which would create immense pressure for more direct US military action. This in turn would provoke responses from China and Russia, who have their own strategic interests and allies in the region. The conflict could become a proxy battleground for these great powers, a scenario terrifyingly reminiscent of the Cold War, where regional disputes threatened to escalate into a global nuclear confrontation. The most direct path from this regional conflict to a potential World War III lies in the entanglement of the great powers. The current crisis is not just about Israel and Iran. It is a flashpoint in the growing global rivalry between the United States, China, and Russia. Each of these powers has deep-seated interests and alliances in the Middle East, and a full-scale war would force them to take sides in a much more direct and dangerous way. The United States is bound by a long-standing commitment to Israel's security. If Israel's existence were perceived to be under serious threat, it is almost certain that the US would intervene more forcefully, moving beyond defensive support to direct offensive action against Iran. Such a move by the United States would be a red line for its global rivals. Russia has cultivated a close partnership with Iran, particularly in Syria, and would view a US attack on its ally as a major threat to its own regional influence. China, which relies heavily on Iranian oil and sees Iran as a key node in its Belt and Road Initiative, would also be staunchly opposed to American military action. In response, Russia and China could increase their support for Iran, providing advanced weaponry, intelligence, and economic aid. This would create a dangerous proxy war, with the world's most powerful militaries backing opposing sides in a highly volatile conflict zone. The risk of miscalculation in such a tense environment is extraordinarily high, with American, Russian, and potentially Chinese military forces operating in close proximity in and around the conflict zone. The potential for an accidental clash is immense. A mistaken targeting of a Russian warship by US forces or an accidental downing of a Chinese aircraft could be the spark that ignites a direct confrontation between nuclear-armed powers. Historical precedents like the Cuban Missile Crisis have shown how quickly misunderstandings and unintended escalations can bring the world to the brink of annihilation. In the 21st century, with advanced cyber warfare and hypersonic missiles, the timeline for decision-making would be even shorter and the consequences even more devastating. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps defense analysts and world leaders awake at night. A conflict that begins with strikes between Jerusalem and Tehran could draw in Washington, which in turn could provoke a response from Moscow and Beijing. Alliances could be activated, and what started as a regional war to prevent nuclear proliferation could spiral into a global conflict fought by nuclear-armed states. The fate of the world would hang in the balance, dependent on the restraint and wisdom of leaders in several different capitals. The risk is no longer theoretical. The direct involvement of the great powers has made the threat of a wider global war more real than it has been at any point since the end of the Cold War. The world currently stands at a perilous crossroads. The direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran has unleashed forces that, if left unchecked, could lead to a catastrophic regional war with devastating global consequences. The tit-for-tat cycle of escalation, the targeting of nuclear facilities, and the involvement of great powers have created a situation of extreme fragility. However, even in this dark moment, there remains a narrow path away from the abyss. The immediate and paramount priority for global leaders must be to pursue rapid de-escalation. This requires intense, urgent, and coordinated diplomacy aimed at pulling both sides back from the brink. The first step must be to establish a ceasefire, even a temporary one, to halt the immediate violence and create a space for dialogue. This is where third-party mediators can play a crucial role. Powers like China and Russia, who have condemned Israel's actions but also offered to mediate, should be taken up on their offers. The United States, despite its alliance with Israel, must use its considerable influence to press for restraint. A concerted, unified message from the world's major powers, the US, China, Russia, and the European Union, insisting on an immediate cessation of hostilities is essential. This is not a time for geopolitical point scoring. It is a time for collective responsibility to prevent a wider catastrophe. Alongside a ceasefire, there must be a renewed push to address the core issue at the heart of the conflict: Iran's nuclear program. The military option has proven to be incredibly dangerous and destabilizing. The only viable long-term solution lies in a verifiable and enforceable diplomatic agreement that ensures Iran's nuclear program is exclusively peaceful, while also addressing Israel's legitimate security concerns. This may seem impossible in the current climate, but the alternative is far worse. A new framework, perhaps building on the old 2015 nuclear deal, but with stronger verification measures and broader scope, is desperately needed to provide an off-ramp from the current military confrontation. Ultimately, leadership and political courage are required. Leaders in Israel and Iran must recognize that continuing on the current path will lead only to mutual destruction and regional ruin. Leaders in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow must understand that their rivalry cannot be allowed to play out in a theater as volatile as the Middle East. They have a shared interest in preventing a global conflict that would spare no one. The path forward requires stepping back from maximalist demands, embracing difficult compromises, and prioritizing the collective security of the global community over short-term strategic advantage. The world is watching and hoping that wisdom will prevail over the drumbeat of war.